Do you think a stroke left my mind as useless as my cane? Victoria, I didn't scream when my own blood robbed me blind. Instead, I laid a trap. I'm Elias Vance, and 80-year-old retired Harvard history professor from Boston, Massachusetts. Before I tell you how I quietly destroyed those who betrayed me, please subscribe. Also tell me in the comments what country are you listening from, and what would you do in my shoes? Story begins. To understand the depth of a betrayal, one must first understand the sanctuary that was violated. For 2 years, my world was defined by the 4 walls of my library in our Beacon Hill brownstone. It is a room that smells of things that have survived the friction of time: English leather, dried lavender, and the faint, sweet, vanilla scent of decomposing lignin from 200-year-old paper. To a stranger, it might have looked like a hoarder's paradise. To me, every spine on those mahogany shelves was a living witness to human history. I had first edition volumes of early American political treatises, journals handwritten by privateers during the War of 1812, and a pristine, calfskin, bound Bible from the late colonial era, signed by a man who had stood on the green at Lexington. History teaches you to observe the smallest deviations: a change in the wind before a battle, a sudden silence in a crowded room. It was a crisp Tuesday morning in early October, when my own personal history shifted on its axis. The Boston air outside the bay window was biting, painting the leaves along the Charles River in shades of violent amber and rust. I was sitting in my wingback chair, an open text on the Salem witch trials resting on my lap, and a porcelain cup of Earl Grey tea balanced in my left hand. Then, without warning, the world tilted. It wasn't a dramatic explosion of pain. It was a subtraction, a quiet, terrifying subtraction of reality. The porcelain cup suddenly felt impossibly heavy, as if filled with lead instead of water. My fingers refused to acknowledge the commands of my brain. I watched, with a strange, detached curiosity. As the cup slipped from my grasp, it didn't shatter on the thick Persian rug. It merely tipped over, a dark, steaming puddle expanding across the intricate blue silk patterns. When I tried to reach down with my left hand to blot the stain, my arm hung limp at my side. A useless pendulum. I thought. The inner voice of the historian remaining oddly clinical. A stroke. The subsequent hours are a blur of sirens, the harsh glare of fluorescent lights, and the rhythmic, aggressive thumping of an MRI machine at Massachusetts General Hospital. The doctors called it a transient ischemic attack, a minor stroke. My speech returned within 48 hours, and the fog in my mind cleared like morning mist over the harbor. But my left leg and left arm remained stubborn, weak and sluggish. The physical body, it seemed, had decided to file for a partial retirement. But while the flesh was weak, the intellect was entirely intact. In fact, the sudden forced stillness of my body seemed to sharpen my perception, funneling all my remaining energy into my eyes and ears. And that was when Victoria arrived. The sound of her heels preceded her down the sterile hospital corridor, a sharp, hurried clack. Clack, clack, that favored rhythm over elegance. Victoria was my brother's granddaughter, my only living relative since my beloved Abigail passed away a decade ago. She lived in Manhattan, working in some vague, high-concept marketing firm that seemed to produce nothing of substance, but demanded she wear designer clothes and attend expensive galas. We saw each other twice a year. I had always known she was a creature of the modern world, transactional, impatient, and deeply insecure about her social standing. But she was family, and an old man in a hospital bed wants to believe in family. She burst into the room, a cloud of expensive French perfume instantly overpowering the smell of antiseptic. Her eyes were wide, her makeup slightly smudged, just enough to suggest she had been crying on the Asila train from New York. "Oh, Uncle Elias," she cried, rushing to the bedside and wrapping her arms around me. Her silk scarf brushed against my chin. It was a perfect performance, but as she pulled away, her eyes didn't rest on my face. They darted down to the plastic hospital bracelet around my wrist, then to the bedside table where my gold vintage Omega watch lay, and finally back to me. The doctor said you're going to be fine, but you need rest. Absolute rest, she said, her voice pitched an octave higher than normal. It was the tone people use when speaking to toddlers or the infirm. You can't be worrying about bills, or the house, or your medical insurance. It's too much for your heart. Umult. Victoria. Not helpless. I managed to say, my voice raspy, but clear. Of course you aren't, darling, she purred, pulling a chair close to the bed and taking my right hand, the good hand, in hers. Her fingers were cold, despite the autumn heat in the room, but we have to be practical. The hospital needs a primary contact for financial approvals. The Historic Preservation Society is calling about the brownstones property taxes. I can handle all of it for you. I want to handle it. You've done so much for this family. She reached into her oversized leather tote bag and pulled out a document. It was neatly bound in a blue legal folder. The words, "Temporary Power of Attorney for Healthcare and Finances," were printed across the top in a clean, partably CSS, authoritative font. I looked at the paper. Then I looked at Victoria. In my lectures, I often spoke about the concept of the pretext, the stated reason for an invasion or a treaty, versus the actual, hidden motivation. A good historian never looks at the document in isolation. They look at the context. Victoria's breathing was shallow. A tiny muscle near her jawline was twitching. Her Cartier bracelet clinked softly against the metal bedrail as she handed me a heavy gold pen. My internal monologue was a battlefield. One side, the lonely old man, whispered, "Sign it. She is your brother's flesh and blood. Let her help you. You are 80 years old, paralyzed on one side, and you cannot fight the bureaucracy of the modern world alone." But the other side, the professor who had spent 50 years analyzing the deceptions of kings, presidents, and generals, noted something else. The document wasn't a standard, boilerplate hospital form. It was comprehensive. It gave her the power to liquidate assets, to access safe deposit boxes, to manage private collections. It was a document prepared by a high-priced attorney, not a panicked relative who had just rushed off a train. It's just temporary. Uncle, she urged softly, placing the pen in my fingers, just until you're back on your feet and walking through Beacon Hill again. I looked down at my limp left hand resting on the white cotton sheets. I felt a profound sense of vulnerability. It is a terrifying thing to realize that your physical independence has vanished overnight. It makes you malleable. It makes you want to surrender. I gripped the pen. I knew, deep in my gut, that there was a shadow behind her smile. I knew that by signing this, I was opening the gates of my fortress to a potential enemy. But a strategy requires a starting point. To catch a thief, one must sometimes provide the treasure. If Victoria was truly the dutiful niece, this paper would protect me. If she was a vulture, it would lure her into the open where I could see her clearly. Very well, Victoria, I whispered, with a slow, deliberate motion. I signed my name at the bottom of the parchment, Elias Vinci. The ink was dark, permanent, and heavy. The moment the pen lifted, the air in the room changed. The synthetic sorrow in Victoria's face vanished, replaced by a sharp, satisfied tightness around her lips. She didn't let the ink dry before she snatched the document back, sliding it into her bag with a swiftness that bordered on predatory blank. "Get some rest, Uncle," she said, already standing up and checking her phone. "I'll go take care of everything." She left the room without looking back. As the door clicked shut, the silence of the hospital room enveloped me. I looked out the window at the graying Boston sky. I had given her the keys to my life. Now I could only wait to see what she would do with them. There is a specific kind of silence that belongs exclusively to hospital rooms at 3 o'clock in the morning. It is not the peaceful quiet of a sleeping home, but a synthetic, fragile stillness punctured by the rhythmic, mechanical sighing of the ventilation system and the distant, muted beep of a telemetry monitor down the hall. In those hours, as I lay beneath the thin, stiff cotton sheets of Massachusetts General Hospital, I had nothing to do but measure the passage of time by the slow drip of the IV fluid into my right arm. For 2 weeks, that room became my world. 2 weeks of white walls, plastic trays of unseasoned food, and the quiet indignity of having young, hurried nurses help me sit up, swing my stubborn left leg out of bed, and guide me into a wheelchair. To a man who had spent his entire life fiercely independent, navigating the vast terrains of intellectual history, this physical regression was a bitter pill. When you are 80, a stroke does not just attack your neurological pathways. It assaults your dignity. It whispers to you that your time as an active participant in the world is drawing to a close, and that you are now merely a burden to be managed. But while my left hand remained curled and uncooperative like a dry leaf, my mind was entirely clear. If anything, the forced stillness of my body amplified my hearing and sharpened my sight. I found myself observing the hospital staff with the same clinical detachment I used to analyze ancient Roman census data. I mapped their routines, noted the subtle shifts in their exhaustion levels, and learned to read the unspoken anxieties hidden behind their professional smiles. And then, there was Victoria. To the hospital staff, my grandniece was an absolute saint. The nurses on the floor openly whispered about how lucky Professor Vance was to have such a devoted young woman in his life. Every day, at precisely 11 in the morning, she would glide into the room, a vibrant contrast to the sterile drabness of the ward. She brought fresh flowers, unbearably bright lilies and chrysanthemums that smelled too sweet, and arranged them with meticulous care. She would sit by my bedside for hours, peeling apples with a small silver knife she brought from home, cutting them into perfectly uniform wedges, and offering them to me on a paper napkin. "You need your strength, Uncle Elias," she would say, her voice dripping with a syrupy, rehearsed warmth. "The doctors say your neuroplasticity is excellent, but you have to cooperate. You have to eat." I would chew the apple wedges slowly, nodding my head, playing the part of the grateful, fading patriarch. But as the days bled together, my historical training began to override my desire for familial comfort. In my decades at Harvard, I had written extensively on the Byzantine court, a political ecosystem entirely built on superficial deference, elaborate court rituals, and lethal backstabbing. You learn very quickly when studying the Byzantines that the person who bows the lowest is often the one measuring the distance between your ribs for a dagger. I began to watch Victoria through that specific historical lens. I noticed, for instance, the sudden and dramatic evolution of her wardrobe. When she first arrived from New York, she looked like a stressed, mid-level corporate worker under a mountain of debt. Her coat was slightly frayed at the cuffs, her shoes sensible but worn. But by the second week of my stay, a transformation had occurred. One afternoon, she casually tossed a brand new buttery, soft leather handbag onto the foot of my bed. I recognized the discreet, interlocking gold logo. It was a piece of Italian luxury that cost more than a semester's worth of textbooks. When I asked her about it, she laughed a brittle, high-pitched sound that ended too abruptly. "Oh, this old thing," she said, smoothing down the front of her tailored cashmere sweater, another new addition, a little retail therapy. "Uncle, my firm just closed a major account, and they threw a massive bonus my way. I figured, why not treat myself?" "Life is short, indeed," I murmured, leaning my head back against the stiff hospital pillow. "Life is remarkably short, Victoria, and bonuses are a rare blessing in this economy." She didn't catch the dry irony in my voice. She was already looking at her phone, her thumb flicking across the glass screen with manic speed. That phone was her constant companion. It vibrated incessantly, a low, angry buzz that she would instantly smother by pressing her palm against her purse. Whenever it rang, she would stiffen, her eyes darting to my face to see if I was watching, before offering a tight, apologetic smile. "Work never sleeps," she would sigh, stepping out into the hallway to answer it. Through the heavy wood and glass door of my room, I could see her silhouette. She didn't look like a woman handling marketing strategy. Her posture was tense, her shoulders hunched forward, her free hand carving sharp, aggressive arcs through the air, as she argued with whoever was on the other end of the line. When she returned, her face would be flushed beneath her expensive makeup, but she would immediately mask it with that wide, vacant smile. "Just logistics, Uncle," she would say smoothly. "Nothing for you to worry about. I'm handling it." Handling it. The phrase began to echo uncomfortably in my mind. She was handling my mail. She was handling my bills. She had the temporary power of attorney, which I knew she had already filed with my bank, because she had proudly shown me the confirmation email on her tablet, noting that she had streamlined my accounts to ensure the hospital bills were paid without delay. I felt a cold, creeping dread take root in my chest. It wasn't an intellectual suspicion yet. It was an instinct. The same instinct that tells an experienced captain that the sudden drop in barometric pressure means a devastating storm is brewing just beyond the horizon. I looked at this young woman, my brother's granddaughter, the last living link to my family history, and I realized I didn't know her at all. I only knew the mask she chose to wear in front of me. The true test of a mask is how it holds up when the actor thinks the audience is asleep. On the final Friday of my stay, the late afternoon sun was cutting sharp, dusty shafts of golden light across the linoleum floor. I had spent 2 grueling hours in physical therapy, trying to force my left foot to lift more than an inch off the ground. I was exhausted, drained of energy, and thoroughly demoralized. When I returned to the room, I sank into the bed and closed my eyes, letting my breathing slow into the deep, heavy rhythm of a man fast asleep. Victoria was sitting in the armchair by the window. For 30 minutes, the only sound was the rustle of her magazine. Then her phone buzzed. Not a vibration this time, but a sharp, audible ringtone that she had forgotten to silence. I didn't open my eyes. I didn't stir. I kept my breathing perfectly synchronized. A steady, shallow rise and fall of my chest. I heard her stand up quickly, the leather of the armchair groaning slightly. She didn't walk out into the hallway this time. She stepped toward the far corner of the room, near the window. Assuming that the deep slumber of an octogenarian stroke victim was impenetrable, "I told you not to call me during the day," she hissed. Her voice was entirely stripped of the sweet, comforting cadence she used with me. It was flat, hard, and laced with a desperate edge. There was a pause as the person on the other end spoke. "No, he's asleep. He's completely wiped out from physical therapy," she whispered aggressively. "Listen to me, Julianne. The discharge papers are signed. We are leaving the hospital on Monday morning. He's going back to Beacon Hill." My heart gave a violent thud against my ribs, but I forced my facial muscles to remain completely flaccid. Julianne. The name meant nothing to me. I had no cormorants, no colleagues, no friends named Julian. "I don't care about your timeline," Victoria whispered, her voice cracking slightly with panic. "The temporary POA is only good as long as he's considered recovering and dependent. Once he's back in that house and the home, health aides start coming. My access gets complicated. We have a narrow window." Another pause. She was pacing now, hair soft, soled designer shoes clicking faintly on the floor. "He doesn't suspect a thing," she said, and a chilling touch of arrogance crept back into her tone. "The man is 80 years old. Julian. He can barely remember to lift his left foot. He thinks I'm a saint. He has no idea how many volumes are even in that dusty library. He hasn't cataloged that collection in a decade." A cold sweat broke out across the back of my neck. "The library. Just get the van ready," Victoria commanded, her whisper sharp enough to cut glass. "The old man is coming home on Monday. You have to move the rest of the books tonight." The medical transport van jolted uncomfortably as its tires moved from the smooth asphalt of Cambridge Street onto the historic, uneven cobblestones of Beacon Hill. Every bump vibrated through my weakened left side. A dull, persistent ache that served as a cruel reminder of my new reality. Outside the tinted window, the gas lamps of Pinckney Street stood like solemn sentinels against the gray October sky. The red brick townhouses, with their black shutters and brass knockers, looked exactly as they had for over a century. To the casual observer, nothing had changed. But as the drivers carefully lowered my wheelchair onto the sidewalk, I knew the architecture of my life had completely collapsed. Victoria was a vision of efficiency. She flitted around the transport drivers, flashing her brilliant, practiced smile, slipping them crisp $20 bills, and thanking them for taking such exquisite care of her dear great-uncle. To anyone watching from a neighboring window, she was the epitome of the modern, selfless millennial caregiver, careful with the step. "Boys," she chirped, guiding them through the heavy oak front door of my brownstone. "He's still a little fragile." Fragile? I hated the word. I sat in that mechanical chair, my right hand gripping the silver handle of my cane, so tightly my knuckles turned white. I kept my face utterly expressionless, a blank slate of elderly exhaustion. I let my chin dip toward my chest, playing the part she had scripted for me, the frail, dimming old man who was just glad to be home. Once the drivers left, the heavy front door clicked shut, sealing us inside the quiet, musty warmth of the house. The hallway smelled of old wool, floor wax, and the faint, sweet scent of my late wife's favorite potpourri, which had long since faded into a ghost of a fragrance. "Well, Uncle Elias, you're home," Victoria said, dropping her keys into the silver tray on the entry table with a loud, metallic clatter. She took off her tailored trench coat, revealing another new silk blouse. "I've arranged for a home health aide to start tomorrow morning. She'll handle your meals and your physical therapy exercises. For today, I thought we'd just keep things quiet. I have a few errands to run in downtown Boston, just wrapping up some of your insurance paperwork, so I'll leave you to rest in your chair." "Thank you, Victoria," I said, my voice deliberately pitched to sound a fraction more breathy and uncertain than it actually was. I think I would like to sit in the library for a while. The hospital lights were so terribly bright." "Of course, darling," she said smoothly, stepping behind my wheelchair and pushing me down the narrow hallway. "The library it is." She wheels me into the room, positions my chair near the hearth, and kisses the top of my head. The scent of her expensive perfume lingered in the air, a discordant, chemical intrusion into my sanctuary. "I'll be back in a couple of hours. Don't try to get up on your own." "Okay, promise me." "I promise," I whispered, the moment the heavy front door clicked shut for the second time, signaling her departure. The fragile illusion of my peace vanished. I sat perfectly still for several minutes, listening to the house. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked with a heavy, deliberate rhythm. Tick-tock, tick-tock. It was the sound of a countdown. I didn't look at the shelves immediately. I closed my eyes and breathed in. Every archivist, every true collector, knows their library by its scent. A room containing thousands of historic books has a living, placid, breathing atmosphere. It should have been thick, rich and heavy with the aroma of aged vellum, decaying leather, and organic ink. But as I inhaled deeply, my lungs detected a subtle, terrifying thinness in the air. The olfactive weight of the room was gone. It smelled faint, superficial, like a bookstore that had only recently been stocked with modern paperbacks. I opened my eyes and turned my head slowly to the left. From a distance, the mahogany shelves looked identical to the day I left. The tall, imposing spines of history texts, encyclopedias, and leather-bound compilations stood in neat, tight rows. But as my eyes adjusted to the dim afternoon light filtering through the bay window, I began to see the micro-deviations. A volume of Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire was sitting 2 inches further back than it should have been. Arare, 17th century translation of Herodotus, was missing the slight, characteristic tilt it always had against its neighbor. With a surge of adrenaline that seemed to bypass my damaged neurological pathways, I forced my right hand to grip the armrest of the wheelchair. I locked my right leg, put all my weight onto my cane, and dragged my useless left leg up with me. The physical exertion was agonizing. A sharp, hot spike of pain flared in my lower back, and my breath hitched in my throat, but I refused to fall. I leaned heavily on the cane, taking slow, scraping steps toward the far corner of the room. I stopped in front of the floor, to ceiling bookshelves that flanked the fireplace. Behind a row of ordinary, modern history textbooks lay the false mahogany panel, a hidden alcove my grandfather had built during the Prohibition era, which I had repurposed to house the crown jewels of my collection. My right hand trembled as I reached out and pressed the hidden brass latch concealed beneath the molding. The panel popped open with a soft, wooden groan. The alcove was not empty. Victoria was many things, but she was not stupid enough to leave a gaping physical void that even a blind man might notice. The shelves inside the hidden compartment were packed with books. I reached out with my right hand and pulled down a thick, heavy volume that was supposed to be a 1,775 colonial Bible, bound in calfskin and signed by a Lexington Minuteman. The moment my fingertips brushed the material, a cold spike of fury pierced my chest. It wasn't calfskin. It was cheap, modern bookcloth, cleverly textured to mimic the grain of old leather. I opened the cover. The paper inside was thick and coarse, but it was machine, cut perfectly uniform, and smelled faintly of cheap industrial adhesive and coffee grinds. An amateur's attempt to simulate age, the text inside was a cheap, modern reprint of a completely unrelated theological text. It was a dummy, a theatrical prop. I dropped the fake book. It hit the hardwood floor with a hollow, plastic-sounding thud. On B1, using my single good hand, I pulled the other volumes from the hidden shelf, the early American political tracts, the privateer journals from the War of 1812, all of them gone, replaced by a meticulous, mocking row of worthless counterfeits. The sheer scale of the theft was breathtaking. This wasn't a crime of opportunity. It was a cold, calculated liquidation of my life's passion, executed while I was fighting for my life in a hospital bed. She had used the power of attorney not to protect me, but to dismantle my legacy, book by book, selling them off to fund her grotesque, superficial life in New York. A profound sense of grief threatened to overwhelm me. My throat tightened, and for a terrifying second, I felt the phantom weakness in my left side threaten to pull me down to the floor. I wanted to weep. I wanted to rage. I wanted to call the police and scream down the phone until my lungs gave out. But then, the historian in me took over. Grief is a passive emotion. Rage is disorganized. Neither would get my books back. In the theater of war, an emotional commander is a dead commander. I remembered my own lectures on the fall of Carthage, how the Romans didn't just attack, they studied the infrastructure of their enemy, waited for the perfect psychological moment, and systematically dismantled them from the inside out. Victoria believed I was a broken shell. She believed my silence was a symptom of cognitive decline. That misconception was now my greatest tactical advantage. I would give her exactly what she expected. I would be the oblivious, incompliant victim, until the noose was firmly around her neck. I carefully picked up the counterfeit books and placed them back inside the hidden alcove, aligning them perfectly. I closed the secret panel, ensuring the latch clicked securely, then dragging my left leg with agonizing slowness, I made my way out of the library and into the small adjacent living room. If Victoria had been moving large quantities of rare books out of this house in a rush, she would have been sloppy. The criminal mind, when driven by sudden wealth and arrogance, always leaves a trail. I approached the small, wicker wastebasket near the writing desk. Victoria usually emptied the trash before leaving, but in her haste to run her errands today, she had overlooked it. I leaned down, my balance wavering dangerously as I supported myself with my cane. Using the tips of my fingers, I sifted through a few discarded junk mail envelopes and tissues. At the very bottom of the basket, my fingers brushed against something stiff and textured. I pulled it out. It was a piece of grade, heavy cream cardstock, torn into quarters. Moving back to my wheelchair, I sat down and arranged the 4 torn pieces on my lap like a jigsaw puzzle. The elegant, embossed black lettering came into focus. Sterling, Gallery Fine Arts and Rare Antiquities. Julian Sterling, Managing Director, Newberry Street, Boston. M.A. turned over. On the reverse side of the card, there was a handwritten note in sharp, aggressive cursive. I would recognize that handwriting anywhere. It was the same elegant script Victoria used on her thank you notes. Final transaction. The Salem Diary. 400美元. Ling. Wire transfer to the usual offshore account upon physical delivery Monday afternoon. I checked the clock on the wall. It was 1:45 p.m. on Monday. Victoria had left the house less than 40 minutes ago. The final transaction was happening today. Right now, the temptation to immediately pick up the rotary telephone on my writing desk and dial 911 was a physical pressure in my chest. My hand hovered over the black plastic receiver, trembling with an erratic, furious energy. But history is a brutal teacher, and it has taught me that the first impulse in a crisis is almost always a tactical error. If I called the Boston Police Department, what would happen? 2 patrol officers would arrive at my Beacon Hill brownstone. They would see an 80-year-old stroke survivor, physically compromised and visibly shaken. claiming his immaculate grandniece was stealing old books. Victoria would produce the temporary power of attorney. She would flash her brilliant, tearful smile and tell the officers that poor Uncle Elias was experiencing post-stroke paranoia, a tragic but common side effect of neurological trauma. The police would write a polite, patronizing report, advise me to get some rest, and leave. And the moment they were gone, Victoria would realize the game was up. She would liquidate the remaining collection, destroy the paper trail, and perhaps have me quietly committed to a private memory care facility in upstate New York, where my voice would never be heard again. No. In a war of asymmetric capabilities, a direct frontal assault is suicide. You do not attack the fortress. You poison the water supply. You let the enemy believe their logistics are flawless while you systematically rebuild the terrain beneath their feet. I pulled my hand away from the telephone. I sat back in my wheelchair, closed my eyes, and began to assemble my own army. Over 50 years of teaching at Harvard, I had cultivated more than just a library. I had cultivated minds. A significant number of my former students had gone on to inhabit the upper echelons of American bureaucracy, not the visible, political layers, but the deep, permanent machinery of federal enforcement, using my landline over the next 48 hours. During the precise windows when Victoria was out of the house or asleep in the guest bedroom upstairs, I made 2 phone calls. The first was to Marcus Hayes, 25 years ago. Marcus was a brilliant, fiercely meticulous graduate student who wrote his master's thesis under my supervision on the illicit antiquities trade during the Napoleonic Wars. Today, he was a special agent with the FBI's art crime team, stationed out of the Boston field office. When Marcus heard my voice, his tone shifted instantly. From professional guardedness to deep warmth. "Professor Vance," he said, the old reverence clear in his voice. "To what do I owe the honor I read about your health scare in the Harvard alumni newsletter? How are you holding up? The scaffolding is a bit shaky." "Marcus, but the architectural integrity remains intact," I replied, my voice steady and low. "I am calling you because I require your specific expertise. Not as a friend, but as a federal officer. A significant portion of my private collection has been systematically removed from my home and replaced with sophisticated counterfeits." There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. The academic warmth vanished, replaced instantly by the cold precision of an investigator. "Tell me everything, Professor." I laid out the facts with chronological exactness. The stroke, the power of attorney, the phone conversation I overheard in the hospital, the counterfeit volumes in the hidden alcove, and the torn business card of the Sterling Gallery on Newberry Street. "Julianne Sterling," Marcus muttered, and I could hear the sound of a keyboard clacking rapidly in the background. "Professor, you've stumbled into something much larger than a domestic theft. The art crime team has had Sterling on a gray list for 18 months. We know he operates as a high-end fence for stolen European manuscripts, but his operational security is pristine. He uses a complex network of shell companies and offshore accounts to obscure the money trail. We've never been able to establish probable cause for a search warrant because his clients are ultra-wealthy individuals who prefer discretion over legality. And what if the paper trail didn't originate from Europe? Marcus, what if it originated in my living room? If we can prove he knowingly purchased stolen cultural property from an unauthorized agent using a fraudulent power of attorney, that's a federal wire fraud and interstate transportation of stolen property. Marcus explained, "Is excitement palpable, but we need the financial link. We need to prove the money changed hands." That brought me to my second phone call. Sarah Lynn had been the top student in my 2008 seminar on the economic history of the Roman Empire. She had a terrifyingly sharp mind for tracking hidden wealth, a talent she now utilized as a senior special agent for the IRS Criminal Investigation Division. When I presented Sarah with the details of the handwritten note on the back of Sterling's business card, the mention of a $400,000 wire transfer to an unusual offshore account, she didn't hesitate. If Julian Sterling is wiring sums of that magnitude to an offshore account associated with your grandniece, Professor, he's creating a massive tax anomaly, Sarah said, her voice crackling with bureaucratic focus. The IRS doesn't need a high standard of probable cause to flag suspicious foreign transactions under the Bank Secrecy Act. Give me 48 hours. I will look into Victoria Vance's financial footprint. The trap was being constructed in the dark, entirely invisible to the world, and while my former students wove the legal net, I was forced to endure the daily torture of Victoria's company. Every evening, she would return to the brownstone, smelling of expensive cocktails and the crisp autumn air. She would bring small, insulting gifts, a box of sugar, free chocolates, a pair of orthopedic slippers, and present them with that grotesque, theatrical affection. "How is my favorite uncle today?" she would ask, kissing my cheek. "Managing. Victoria, just managing," I would reply, looking past her at the new luxury items that seemed to accumulate in her possession with terrifying speed. One evening, she walked into the living room, wearing a pair of diamond studs that caught the light of the fire with an aggressive, blinding brilliance. On her wrist was a new platinum watch. She noticed me looking at it. "A gift to myself." "Uncle," she said smoothly, pouring herself a glass of my 20-year-old scotch. "The firm is treating me very well. They say my instincts are predatory." "In a good way, predatory," I repeated, tasting the syllables like ash. "A highly valued trait in the modern market. I imagine it's a dog. Eat dog world, Uncle Elias. You have to take what's yours before someone else does." I watched her through the rim of my teacup. I saw the way her eyes traveled across the room when she thought I wasn't looking. She wasn't looking at the books anymore. She had already extracted their value. She was looking at the original oil paintings on the walls. She was looking at the structural integrity of the mahogany beams. She was mentally staging the house for an estate sale. In her mind, I was already a ghost. I was a minor inconvenience, a lingering piece of biological clutter that was taking too long to dissolve. I could read it in the subtle impatience of her movements, the way her smile faded, the instant she turned her back to me, the way she spoke about the house in the past tense. This place must have been so beautiful in the 70s. "Uncle." The grief I felt initially was entirely gone, replaced by a cold, calcified determination. Victoria had not just stolen my property, she had desecrated the memory of my family. She had looked at my physical vulnerability and seen an opportunity to exploit me. She deserved no mercy, and I intended to show her none. 3 weeks after my return from the hospital, the snare was finally set. Marcus and Sarah had done their work with terrifying efficiency. They had tracked the $400,000 wire transfer from a shell company controlled by Julian Sterling in the Cayman Islands, directly to a newly established private bank account in Switzerland, under Victoria's name. More importantly, they discovered that Sterling had already resold 3 of my colonial-era volumes to a private collector in Tokyo. The federal crimes were fully documented. The ledger was complete. All that was required was to bring the players into the same room. On a rainy Thursday afternoon, Victoria walked into the library. She looked uncharacteristically nervous, her fingers twitching against the strap of her handbag. She sat down opposite me, her face contorted into an expression of deep, manufactured concern. "Uncle Elias," she began, her voice dropping into that soft, patronizing register. "I've been doing some thinking about your estate. With your health the way it is, the property taxes and the maintenance on this old place are going to eat through your savings very quickly." "Is that so?" I said, leaning my cane against my leg. "Yes, darling, and I want to protect you," she said, leaning forward and taking my hand. Her touch felt like ice. "I have a close friend, a highly respected financial consultant and antiquities expert named Julian Sterling. He specializes in helping historic families restructure their assets to minimize their tax burden. He's actually in Boston today, and I asked him to stop by. He can look over your finances and the library and give us a professional assessment. It's completely free, just as a favor to me." She looked at me, her eyes wide, searching my face for any hint of suspicion, any spark of resistance. She was offering me the very blade she intended to use to cut my throat. I looked at her for a long, still moment. I let a slow, weary smile spread across my face. "That sounds incredibly thoughtful of you, Victoria," I whispered, my voice sounding fragile, compliant, and thoroughly broken. "Please, invite Mr. Sterling in." I would be fascinated to hear what he has to say about my collection. The rain had turned the Boston dusk into a slate, gray canvas, blurring the sharp edges of the Beacon Hill brickwork. Outside the library's bay window, the street lamps flickered to life, casting long, distorted reflections across the wet cobblestones of Pinckney Street. Inside, the only light came from the low, amber glow of the hearth fire, and a single green, shaded banker's lamp resting on my mahogany desk. I spent the hour before their arrival in meticulous preparation. I did not arrange the room to look intimidating. I arranged it to look comfortable, vulnerable, and completely unsuspecting. I set out the silver tea service that had belonged to my wife, Abigail, a beautiful, heavy Georgian set that Victoria had always coveted. I polished the silver until it reflected the dancing flames of the fireplace. Beside the tray, I placed 3 porcelain cups, a small crystal bowl of lemon wedges, and a plate of shortbread cookies. Then I sat down in my wingback chair, rested my cane against my right knee, and waited. At precisely 4 o'clock, the heavy brass knocker on the front door echoed through the quiet house. Thud, thud, thud. I heard Victoria's hurried footsteps in the hallway, followed by the murmur of greeting. A moment later, she escorted our guest into the library. Julian Sterling was exactly the type of predator history prepares you for. He was a man in his mid-40s, tall, lean, and possessing the immaculate, superficial polish of Newbury Street wealth. He wore a charcoal, gray bespoke suit that fell perfectly over his shoulders, a crisp white shirt with monogrammed cuffs, and a vintage gold Patek Philippe watch that whispered rather than screamed its value. His hair was silver at the temples, combed back with military precision, but it was his eyes that caught my attention. They were a pale, crystalline blue, entirely devoid of warmth. Before he even looked at me, those eyes swept the room, cataloging the oil paintings on the walls, measuring the width of the mahogany beams, and assessing the value of my sanctuary in a fraction of a second. "Uncle Elias," Victoria said, her voice trilling with that manufactured, high-register enthusiasm. She stepped toward my chair, her hand resting lightly on Sterling's forearm. "This is Julian Sterling, the gentleman I told you about from the gallery, Professor Vance," Sterling said, stepping forward and extending a manicured hand. His grip was firm, calibrated to convey respect while establishing dominance. "It is a profound honor to meet you. Your work on the economic structures of early American commerce is required reading in my field. You are very kind, Mr. Sterling," I said, allowing my voice to carry a slight tremulous rasp. I took his hand with my right, keeping my left hand limply tucked into the fold of my cardigan. "Please, sit. The autumn air is bitter today, and old bones feel the dampness before anyone else." Sterling sat in the leather armchair opposite me, crossing one leg elegantly over the other. Victoria remained standing for a moment, playing the attentive hostess. Before settling onto the small velvet settee near the fire, I took the liberty of preparing some Earl Grey, I said, gesturing toward the silver tray with a weak wave of my right hand. "Victoria, darling, would you pour?" "Of course, Uncle," she said smoothly. The silver spoons clinked against the porcelain, a sharp, domestic sound that seemed to punctuate the underlying tension in the room. For the first 20 minutes, the conversation flowed with a deceptive, sluggish ease. Sterling was a master of his craft. He did not immediately bring up the library or the books. Instead, he spoke of the Boston art market, the upcoming auctions in New York, and the tragic decline of historical literacy in the younger generation. He flattered my intellect, agreed with my observations on colonial architecture, and presented himself as a humble custodian of history. Victoria watched us, a subtle, triumphant gleam in her eyes. She thought she had staged the perfect ambush. She thought she was watching a brilliant predator charm, a defenseless, senile old man. "You know, Professor," Sterling said, setting his teacup down with a soft click, "Victoria has expressed some very valid concerns about the preservation of your legacy. A collection of this magnitude requires environmental controls, humidity regulation, UV protection, that these beautiful old brownstones simply cannot provide. It would be a tragedy if these treasures were to degrade. History always degrades." "Mr. Sterling," I murmured, staring into the fire. "It is the nature of time. Empires crumble. Documents rot. Menfalde, true Sterling smiled, a thin, predatory movement of his lips, but we can slow the process. I have a client, a very private, very wealthy philanthropic foundation that is currently looking to endow a private museum dedicated exactly to the type of literature you have spent your life collecting. If you were open to a comprehensive assessment, we could look at a structure that would secure your financial comfort for the rest of your days. While ensuring these books are preserved in perpetuity, I lean my head back against the wingback chair, closing my eyes for a brief moment as if overwhelmed by the thought. Preservation, I whispered, opening my eyes to look directly into his pale blue gaze. A fascinating concept, but you see, Mr. Sterling, history has taught me that preservation is often just a polite euphemism for plunder. When the British entered Washington in 1814, they didn't claim they were burning the Library of Congress. They claimed they were liberating it from an uncultured republic. Sterling's smile stiffened slightly. A tiny shadow of uncertainty crossed his features, vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. I assure you, Professor, my intentions are entirely professional. I'm sure they are, I said, my voice dropping its frail rasp, returning to the deep, resonant baritone that had commanded lecture halls for 40 years. Just as Benedict Arnold's intentions were professional when he negotiated the surrender of West Point, he didn't think he was a traitor, Mr. Sterling. He thought he was simply liquidating an asset that the Continental Army didn't appreciate. Victoria sat up straighter on the settee, her brow furrowing. Uncle Elias. What a strange thing to say. Is it, Victoria? I reached down beside my chair, picked up the remote control for the vintage Macintosh stereo system on the bookshelf behind me, and pressed a button. The soft, gentle piano music that had been playing in the background stopped. In its place, the heavy, mournful strings of Mozart's Requiem began to swell, filling the high, ceilinged room with a dark, cinematic gravity. The atmosphere in the library shifted on its axis. The warmth of the fire suddenly felt oppressive. I reached into the inner pocket of my tweed jacket with my right hand. Slowly, deliberately, I withdrew 2 white rectangles of heavy cardstock and laid them side by side on the silver tea tray, right between the lemon wedges and the shortbread. Do you think a stroke left my mind as useless as my cane? Victoria, I said, looking directly at my grandniece. Victoria stared at the tray. Her face drained of color so fast it looked as though she had been struck. The 2 cards sat under the amber lamplight. One bore the gold and blue seal of the FBI art crime team, with Agent Marcus Hayes' name printed below it. The other was the stark, minimalist credential of the IRS Criminal Investigation Division, bearing the name of Special Agent Sarah Lynn. Julian Sterling's eyes snapped down to the cards, then back up to me. His elegant posture vanished, his shoulders tightening into a defensive, rigid line. He went to stand up. I suggest you remain seated. Mr. Sterling, I said, my voice entirely devoid of emotion, hard as New England granite. The front door is locked, and there are 2 federal agents sitting in an unmarked vehicle 40 feet from my steps. If you walk out that door, you are entering a federal indictment from which there is no return. Uncle, what is this? Victoria stammered, her voice shaking, her rehearsed confidence shattering into 1,000 jagged pieces. This is crazy. You're having an episode. Julian, we should go. Julian isn't going anywhere. Victoria, I said calmly, leaning forward, resting both hands on the silver head of my cane, because Julian is a businessman, and a businessman knows when a venture has reached total liquidation. I turned my attention fully to Sterling. The man was calculating, his mind working furiously behind those pale blue eyes, looking for an exit, a loophole, a lee. Mr. Sterling, I said, lacing my fingers over my cane, we are going to talk about the Salem Diary. We are going to talk about the 3 colonial volumes currently residing in a climate-controlled vault in Tokyo. And most importantly, we are going to talk about the $400,000 you wired from your shell corporation in the Cayman Islands to a private account in Zurich under my niece's name. Sterling swallowed hard. The immaculate, untouchable Newberry Street director had vanished. In his place sat a man who could suddenly smell the cold, sterile air of a federal penitentiary. Professor Vance. Sterling began. his voice dropping its polished cadence, becoming hurried and low. Yemenat Dila. I was presented with a legal power of attorney. I had no reason to believe. You had every reason to believe. Julian, I interrupted, cutting through his protest like a scalpel. You bought rare antiquities at 40% of their market value from a 32-year-old marketing executive who didn't know the difference between vellum and parchment. You knew exactly what she was doing. And more importantly, the IRS knows exactly what you have been doing. Sarah Lynn spent the last 72 hours dissecting your domestic tax returns against your foreign wire transfers. You aren't just looking at an antiquities theft charge. Mr. Sterling, you are looking at 20 years for systematic, international tax fraud and money laundering. Sterling's face went a sickly shade of gray. His hands, previously so still, began to twitch against his knees. I leaned back in my chair, the heavy movements of the lacrimosa echoing from the speakers, enveloping the three of us in the music of a funeral. Yemen Oatman, Mr. Sterling, I said softly, looking at him with a detachment that terrified him more than any shout could have. I have no desire to spend my remaining years in a courtroom. I want my books back. Every single one of them. And I want the person who violated this house to pay the full historical price for her betrayal. I paused, letting the silence stretch until it became unbearable. I am going to offer you a covenant, I said, tilting my head. The FBI is prepared to offer you full immunity from the theft and wire fraud charges, and the IRS will negotiate a civil penalty regarding your offshore accounts rather than a criminal prosecution. But that immunity depends entirely on one thing. I reached over and pushed the silver tray an inch closer to him. You have exactly 30 seconds to decide. Julian, you can sign a full confession naming Victoria Vance as the sole instigator of this fraud. Turn over every text message, every email, and every wire confirmation, and act as the state's primary witness, or you can go down with her. 30 seconds. The clock is ticking. The human mind, when cornered, performs a fascinating and predictable set of gymnastics. In my lectures on the fall of the Roman Republic, I often noted that when Julius Caesar crossed the Rubicon, those who had sworn eternal loyalty to the Senate did not engage in a grand philosophical debate. They did not stand on principle. They looked at the size of Caesar's legions, looked at their own shifting fortunes, and immediately began calculating the price of their defection. Julian Sterling was no Roman senator. But the primal machinery of survival operates exactly the same way under a bespoke charcoal suit as it did under a woolen toga. The library was suffocatingly quiet, save for the relentless, weeping strings of Mozart's Lacrimosa and the steady, rhythmic tick, tick-tick of the grandfather clock. Julian stared at the two federal business cards resting on the silver tea tray. A single bead of sweat broke from his neatly combed hairline, tracing a slow path down his temple before disappearing into his collar. His eyes darted left, toward the heavy oak door, then right, toward the bay window. He was a rat testing the perimeter of a cage. Beside him, Victoria was breathing in sharp, ragged gasps. "Julian, don't listen to him," she whispered, her voice cracking, her manicured fingers clawing at the sleeve of his jacket. "He's an old man. He's bluffing. He doesn't have the FBI on speed dial. He can't even walk to the bathroom without that stupid stick." Sterling didn't look at her. He didn't move a muscle to comfort her. The predatory warmth he had exuded just minutes before had entirely evaporated, replaced by a cold, clinical appraisal of his own liabilities. He looked at me, his pale blue eyes stripping away all pretense of the cultured antiquities dealer. 20 seconds. "Mr. Sterling," I said, my voice steady, my hands resting calmly on the silver head of my cane. I did not look at the clock. A historian knows that time is a psychological weapon, not just a mathematical one. Julian Victoria shrieked, her voice rising to a frantic beat, ugly pitch that shattered the scholarly dignity of the room. "Say something." With 10 seconds remaining on my phantom countdown, Sterling made his choice. It was instantaneous, brutal, and entirely devoid of sentimentality. He reached out with a steady hand, pushed Victoria's gripping fingers off his sleeve as if brushing away a piece of lint, and pulled his leather briefcase onto his lap. The power of attorney she gave me stated she had full authorization to liquidate the estate's physical assets to cover your medical expenses. Professor, Sterling said, his voice dropping into a rapid, transactional, monotone. He opened the brass clasps of the briefcase with 2 sharp clicks. But I am a meticulous man. I don't rely on boilerplate legal forms when dealing with collections of this rarity. Julian, what are you doing? Victoria gasped, stepping back from him, her eyes wide with a dawning, horrific comprehension. Sterling ignored her. He pulled a thick, manila folder from the briefcase and laid it over the silver tea service, crushing the shortbread cookies beneath its weight. He flipped it open, revealing a stack of printed emails, bank wire confirmations, and a sleek, black digital voice recorder. She approached me 3 days after your stroke. Professor, Sterling said, looking directly into my eyes, completely cutting Victoria out of the room's geography. She claimed you were suffering from advanced cognitive decline and that the family needed to liquidate the library before the state seized your assets for long. Term care. I have every email she sent from her corporate account. I have the signed consignment agreements where she explicitly demands the funds be wired exclusively to her personal offshore account in Zurich. And he reached down and pressed the play button on the digital recorder. A voice filled the room. It was Victoria's voice, but stripped of the sweet, breathless cadence she used when peeling apples at my hospital bedside. It was sharp, demanding, and dripping with an icy contempt. I don't care about the historical value. Julian, the old man doesn't even know what's in those boxes anymore. He sits in that chair and stares at the wall. Just move the Salem documents by Monday. If he notices a missing spine, I'll tell him he donated it to Harvard 5 years ago. He won't remember. Just get the money into the Swiss account before the end of the month. The recording clicked off. The silence that followed was heavy, absolute, and suffocating. Victoria stood frozen in the center of the Persian rug. The firelight caught the diamond studs in her ears, casting jagged, frantic sparks of light across her face. For a second, she looked like a child caught in a lie, paralyzed, hollowed out by her own recorded words. But then, as the full weight of Sterling's betrayal sank in, the paralysis dissolved into a violent, unhinged rage. You miserable, spineless coward, she screamed, lunging toward Sterling, her fingers curving into claws. Her Cartier bracelet clanked violently against his briefcase as he instinctively threw his arms up to protect his face. You came to my apartment. You told me this was foolproof. You took 40% of the cut for your goddamn shell companies. And now you're throwing me to the wolves. I am protecting my business. Victoria, Sterling said coldly, straightening his tie, his voice entirely detached. You lied to me about the nature of the asset. You lied about your uncle's condition. You are a liability. Victoria spun around to face me, her chest heaving beneath her expensive silk blouse. The mask of the dutiful, loving grandniece was gone, ripped away to reveal the hollow, desperate creature beneath. She advanced on my chair, her heels digging into the blue silk of the rug. You think you've won, you old bastard, she hissed, her face contorting into an ugly, venomous sneer. You think anyone is going to convict me based on the word of a crooked art dealer and a senile octogenarian who belongs in a nursing home? I have the power of attorney. It's signed by your own hand. I'll tie you up in probate court until you die in that chair. I'll sue you for elder abuse. I'll tell the judge you're incompetent. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I merely looked at her, seeing her not as my brother's flesh and blood, but as a tragic, common archetype. The desperate thief who mistakes an old man's patience for weakness. History is full of people who believed their legal pretexts would shield them from their crimes. Victoria, I said softly, the music of the requiem fading into a low, somber murmur behind me. They are almost always forgotten, or worse, remembered only as a cautionary tale. I turned my head toward the largely prined, mahogany pocket doors that separated the library from the formal dining room. Marcus, I called out clearly, I believe we have heard everything we need. The heavy wooden doors slid open with a smooth, oiled hiss. 2 individuals stepped into the amber light of the library. Marcus Hayes came first, wearing a crisp, dark navy suit, his FBI credentials held open in his left hand, his face set in the rigid, unyielding lines of a federal lawman. Behind him walked a female agent, her hand resting discreetly near the holster at her hip. Victoria choked back a sob. Stepping away from my chair so fast, she tripped over the leg of the settee, barely catching herself against the brickwork of the fireplace. Victoria Vance, Marcus said, his voice echoing through the high, ceilinged room with a terrifying, professional finality. I am Special Agent Marcus Hayes with the FBI's art crime team. You are under arrest for federal wire fraud, interstate transportation of stolen cultural property, and grand larceny. The female agent moved forward with a practiced, fluid efficiency. Before Victoria could utter another word, her wrists were pulled behind her back. The sharp, metallic clack of stainless steel handcuffs locking into place was the loudest sound in the room. Uncle Elias, please, Victoria wailed, her anger instantly dissolving back into a high, panicked childhood terror as the cold steel bit into her skin. The tears were real now, streaming down her face, ruining her expensive mascara, leaving dark, ugly tracks down her cheeks. Don't do this to me, I'm family, I'm your only family left. It was the debt. Uncle Elias. The firm was going under. They were going to sue me. I had no choice. We always have a choice. Victoria, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I did not look at her as the agent began to guide her toward the hallway. You chose to look at my vulnerability and see a transaction. You chose to erase my life to fund yours. As her frantic, sobbing apologies faded down the long hallway toward the front door, Julian Sterling stood up, smoothing the front of his charcoal jacket. He offered a tight, professional nod. I assume Agent Hayes will coordinate the recovery of the Tokyo volumes. Professor, Sterling said, reaching for his briefcase. My cooperation will be documented. As agreed. Sit down, Mr. Sterling. A new voice commanded from the doorway. Arthur Pendleton, my personal estate attorney and a trusted friend for 30 years, walked into the library. He was a small, sharp, featured man with wire-rimmed glasses, carrying a thick leather folio under his arm. He didn't look at Sterling. He walked straight to my desk and laid a single, heavy parchment document directly under the banker's lamp. Victoria Vance is not the only one facing a legal reckoning today, Julian, Arthur said, adjusting his glasses. While the FBI processes your cooperation, my firm has filed an emergency injunction with the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. We have freezing orders for the Sterling Gallery's physical inventory and an asset forfeiture attachment against your personal real estate on Newbury Street to secure the full restoration value of Professor Vance's library. Sterling's composure cracked for the second time. His mouth opened slightly, his eyes shifting from Arthur to the legal document on the desk. Now Arthur said, pulling a heavy fountain pen from his pocket and placing it beside the parchment. Let us discuss the immediate, unconditional return of the remaining manuscripts before the federal grand jury convenes tomorrow morning. 3 weeks after that fateful rainy Thursday, a brilliant, piercing November morning broke over Boston. The air was uncommonly clear, crisp as a fresh sheet of parchment, and the frost on the window panes of my Beacon Hill library glittered like crushed diamonds under the pale New England sun. The turbulent storm that had threatened to swallow my life had finally receded, leaving behind the quiet, unyielding clarity that always follows a hard-fought victory. Outside, a white federal transport van pulled up to the curb. There were no flashing lights this time, no dramatique confrontation, just the orderly, professional execution of justice. I sat in my wingback chair, my right hand resting comfortably on the silver handle of my cane, watching through the bay window as Special Agent Marcus Hayes supervised 2 of his colleagues. They walked up my brick steps carrying heavy, specialized climate-controlled containers. When Marcus entered the library, he was wearing the white cotton gloves of a curator. He looked at me with a warmth that made him look less like an FBI agent and more like the brilliant graduate student I had taught decades ago. We have them, Professor, Marcus said, his voice echoing softly in the high, ceilinged room. The Tokyo customs seizure went through without a single legal hitch. Julian Sterling's overseas contacts folded the moment our international attaches presented the asset. Tracing warrants. Unb1. Marcus carefully lifted the volumes from their protective foam linings and placed them on my mahogany desk. There it was, the 1,775 Colonial Bible, its calfskin cover worn smooth at the corners where generations of hands had gripped it. Its historic signature, intact and unfaded. Next came the leather, bound journals of the privateers from the War of 1812. Their salt, stained pages still carrying the silent weight of early American defiance. And finally, the crown jewel, the Salem Diary. Its dark, textured vellum preserved perfectly despite its forced transatlantic journey. Using only my right hand, I slowly pulled myself up from my chair. My left leg was still stiff, a stubborn reminder of my stroke. But as I walked toward the desk, my stride felt grounded, deliberate, and free of the false fragility I had been forced to perform for weeks. I reached down and picked up the Colonial Bible. I held it against my palm, feeling its physical weight, its organic density. Then I breathed in. Instantly, the thin, superficial emptiness that had haunted this room vanished. My lungs were filled once more with the rich, intoxicating symphony of my life's sanctuary, the deep vanilla of decomposing lignin, the earthy tang of ancient ink, and the comforting, musk-like perfume of aged leather. The library was no longer a stage for a crime. It was a living archive once more. With Marcus's assistance, we systematically pulled Victoria's theatrical props from the shelves. We gathered the cheap, coffee, stained counterfeits, the machine, coutret, prints, and the worthless modern bookcloth dummies, stacking them in a heap on the floor. Later that afternoon, I would watch them burn in the fireplace, their synthetic glue crackling and turning into harmless gray ash, as I placed the true, historic volumes back into the hidden alcove behind the mahogany panel, ensuring each spine rested at its exact, traditional angle. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked with a deep, peaceful resonance. Tick-tock, tick-tock. The countdown was over. History had been restored to its rightful shelves. The following morning, Arthur Pendleton arrived at the brownstone, carrying the final legal dispatches from the Commonwealth courts. He sat on the velvet settee, poured himself a cup of black coffee, and adjusted his spectacles with a quiet satisfaction. The temporary power of attorney has been officially and permanently dissolved by judicial order, Elias, Arthur announced, sliding a certified document across the table. The court has appointed my firm as your permanent legal proxy, ensuring your estate is entirely ironclad against any future familial interference. And what of my grandniece? I asked, my voice calm, devoid of malice, but entirely empty of pity. Arthur Sahil, a dry, legal sound. Victoria's high, flying life in Manhattan is a smoking ruin. Her private bank accounts in Zurich have been fully seized under the federal wire fraud indictment to avoid a mandatory 10-year prison sentence. Her attorney negotiated a plea agreement. She has pleaded guilty to grand larceny and interstate transportation of stolen property. He paused, taking a sip of his coffee. The court has ordered the immediate liquidation of her personal assets, her luxury apartment lease, her designer wardrobe, her jewelry, and her vehicle to pay for the full restitution costs, the FBI's international recovery fees, and my firm's legal expenses. She has been sentenced to 5 years of strict federal probation, combined with 2,000 hours of mandatory community service at a state correctional facility. Her professional reputation in New York is completely extinct. No marketing firm will ever touch her name again. I nodded slowly, looking out at the red brick townhouses of Pinckney Street. In the grand tapestry of human history, Victoria's fate was nothing new. She was simply another minor footnote, a textbook example of how arrogance and immediate greed always underestimate the quiet, enduring power of institutional knowledge and strategic patience. She had assumed that my advanced age meant a decay of my faculties. She had forgotten that an old historian does not just remember the past, he knows how to manipulate the present. As for Julian Sterling, his Newbury Street gallery remained open, but it was now a ghost of its former self. He had avoided a prison cell by betraying Victoria, but the cost of his survival was total subjugation. His business was placed under a mandatory 5-year federal monitoring program. Every transaction, every wire transfer, and every piece of inventory he touched was now scrutinized by the FBI and the IRS. The elite, ultra, wealthy clientele who valued absolute discretion abandoned him overnight. He was left a broken man, operating a heavily audited storefront. His name forever toxic in the world of high-end antiquities. The afternoon sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the library walls in deep, warm shades of amber and burgundy. Arthur and Marcus had gone, leaving me alone in the profound, beautiful quiet of my home. The fireplace crackled softly, throwing a gentle warmth across my legs. I sat back in my wingback chair. The physical ache in my left side was still there, but it no longer felt like a prison. It was simply a part of my landscape, a scar from a battle that I had won without firing a single shot, without raising my voice, and without sacrificing a single ounce of my dignity. I reached over to the stereo system and turned the volume down, letting the final chords of the classical melody fade into a peaceful silence. Then I turned my head, looking directly into the quiet space of the room, speaking to you as if you were sitting right here across from me by the hearth. Rare books possess a very unique kind of value, I said, my voice warm, weathered, and deeply reflective. They teach us that the longer a thing survives, the more resilient and precious it becomes. Human beings are no different. The lines on my face, the slowness of my step, and the cane resting against my knee. These are not signs of vulnerability or weakness. They are the map of my experiences. They are the armor of a lifetime spent studying the triumphs and failures of mankind. I paused, letting the warmth of the fire settle between us. My grandniece believed that the modern world belonged only to the young, the swift, and the predatory. But she forgot that the oldest trees have the deepest roots, and it is the roots that hold the ground when the storm arrives. Trí tuệ và sự điềm tĩnh luôn là thứ vũ khí mạnh nhất của tuổi già. I smiled gently, a genuine, peaceful expression. Thank you for sitting with me in my library today and listening to my story until the very end. If you found value in how justice was served in this room, please take a moment to click the like button and share this chronicle with someone who appreciates a good game of intellectual chess. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our next journey into the hidden pages of human nature. Until we meet again, I wish you a beautiful, deeply peaceful evening. Take care of yourselves.